Hello and welcome. You have heard tales of gods who were born divine, beings of pure cosmic essence who never knew the touch of mortality. But what happens when death itself falls into the hands of someone who understands what it means to die? What happens when the one who judges every soul that passes from life into the great beyond once walked among mortals, felt fear in his heart, and knew the desperate weight of an impossible curse? The story you are about to discover is not simply about a god. It is about transformation on a scale that reshapes the very foundations of existence. It is about a man named Kelemvor Lyonsbane, a mercenary who carried a terrible burden, who loved and lost, who fought alongside companions who would reshape the cosmos, and who ultimately became something he never imagined possible. In the grand history of Faerun's deities, few transitions have been as profound as the moment when death gained a judge who remembered what it meant to be alive. In the village of Lionsgate, nestled within the rolling hills of what would later be known as the Dalelands, a child was born into a family drowning in shame and ancient sin. The year was 1297 Dale reckoning, and the Lyonsbane family had already carried their curse for generations. Kelemvor entered a world where his very bloodline condemned him to a fate worse than simple poverty or obscurity. The curse that ran through his veins was not something that could be overcome with gold or status. It was woven into the essence of who he was. The origins of this curse stretched back through the centuries to an ancestor named Kyle. This forebearer had been a skilled mercenary, a warrior of considerable talent who understood the value of his skills. Kyle had fallen in love with a woman, but when she asked him to rescue her from danger, he demanded payment before he would act. His greed in that moment, valuing coin over the life of someone he claimed to love, enraged a sorceress who witnessed his callousness. She cursed Kyle and his entire bloodline, transforming them into a strange variety of panther-like creature who would shift into their beastly form whenever they performed an act purely for profit. But curses are not always stable across generations. Over the centuries, as the curse passed from parent to child, it twisted and changed. By the time 5 generations had elapsed, by the time Kelemvor was born, the curse had reversed itself in the cruelest possible way. Now, a Lyonsbane would transform into the beast if they performed any act of kindness or heroism without demanding payment. The curse forced them to be greedy, to always ask for reward, or face transformation into something less than human. Kelemvor grew up knowing this truth about himself. Imagine spending your childhood aware that your own nature could betray you at any moment. Every decision, every choice about whether to help someone freely or demand compensation carried the weight of potential transformation. The curse did not simply punish selflessness in the moment. It created a constant state of vigilance, a never-ending internal battle between basic human decency and the necessity of demanding payment for every action. The Lyonsbane family had fallen on difficult times long before Kelemvor's birth. Once they had been wealthy, respected, their martial prowess sought after across the Dalelands. But the curse had eroded everything. Clients became wary of hiring warriors who might transform mid-battle. Wealth dwindled. The grand estate became a crumbling reminder of better days. Kelemvor's father struggled with the same burden, and the boy watched as the curse slowly destroyed the man's spirit. There was no cure, no magical ritual that could break what had been imposed generations ago. The only path forward was to always demand payment, always act with self-interest, never give freely. But how does someone live with such a burden? How do you maintain any sense of honor or decency when basic kindness triggers a curse? This was the impossible contradiction at the heart of Kelemvor's existence. He trained in combat from a young age because it was the Lyonsbane tradition, because his body and reflexes were naturally suited to the warrior's path. He became skilled with sword and strategy, learning to read opponents and strike with precision. Yet every time he considered using these skills, the curse loomed in his mind like a shadow. As Kelemvor grew into young adulthood, he made a decision that would define much of his mortal life. He would become a mercenary, selling his sword to those who needed protection. He would demand payment because the curse required it, but he would try to maintain some core of decency within his actions. It was a delicate balance, a daily negotiation with forces beyond his control. The curse cared only for the purity of self-interest, and maintaining that while still being the kind of person he wanted to be was perhaps the most difficult challenge he would ever face. He left Lionsgate and traveled the trade routes of Faerun, selling his sword to caravans and merchants who needed protection. He was good at what he did. His skills were undeniable, his tactical mind sharp, but the transformations came whenever he slipped, whenever compassion or heroism overwhelmed his need to demand reward. Kelemvor would feel the familiar burning in his blood, the sensation of his skeleton beginning to reshape, and he would know he had crossed the invisible line. The curse made no allowances for good intentions or partial selflessness. It was absolute in its judgment. During these years of wandering, during the countless contracts and transformations and moments of shame, when he had to hide what he was from those who hired him, Kelemvor encountered 3 individuals who would change not just his life, but the entire structure of divine power in Faerun. Their meeting was not orchestrated by fate or divine plan. It was the random intersection of 4 desperate people trying to survive in a world that often seemed designed to crush those without power or privilege. The first was a young thief named Cyric. You might know him better as the Mad God, who would later claim multiple dark portfolios. But in those days, he was simply a bitter young man with quick hands and quicker wit. Cyric had grown up on the streets of Gentle Keep, learning to steal before he learned to trust, mastering deception as other children mastered their letters. He was charming when he needed to be, vicious when circumstances demanded it, and always watching for the angle that would benefit him most. Kelemvor and Cyric formed an alliance based on mutual usefulness. The thief needed muscle and someone who could handle direct confrontation. The cursed warrior needed someone who could scout ahead and acquire information. It was not friendship in any real sense, though they traveled together for months. The second companion was Adon, a priest of Sewn Firehair, goddess of beauty and love. Where Cyric was all sharp edges and calculation, Adon was earnest and devoted. He truly believed in the power of beauty to transform lives, in love as a force that could overcome darkness. He was handsome in the way that Sewn's faithful often were, blessed by his goddess with features that drew eyes and hearts, but there was substance beneath the appearance. Adon had chosen his path out of genuine faith, out of a desire to bring light to a world that often seemed determined to extinguish it. His presence balanced the dynamic between Kelemvor and Cyric, providing a moral center that neither of the other two could claim. The third was Midnight, and she was the one who would matter most. When Kelemvor first met her, she was a magic user of considerable talent, but limited formal training. She had learned her spells through determination and natural aptitude rather than years of study in some prestigious academy. There was a hunger in her for knowledge, for understanding the deeper mysteries of the weave, the fabric of magic that connected all arcane power. She was beautiful, but not in the conventional way that Adon's goddess valued. Her beauty came from intelligence and intensity, from the way her eyes focused when she was solving a magical puzzle, from the confidence in her voice when she cast a spell. Kelemvor fell in love with her almost immediately, though he tried to hide it. How could he not? She represented everything his cursed existence made difficult. She pursued knowledge without thought of payment. She cast spells to help others because it was right. But the curse complicated everything. When he tried to protect her without demanding payment, when love made him act selflessly, the transformation would come. His mortal heart wanted to be the hero she deserved, but his cursed blood demanded he always seek reward. Midnight returned his feelings, and for a brief time, they found happiness together despite the complications. They traveled as a group, the four of them, taking contracts and having adventures across the Dalelands and beyond. Cyric provided roguish skills. Adon offered healing and divine magic. Midnight wielded arcane power. Kelemvor stood as their warrior, their protector. It should have been enough. It should have been the beginning of a long partnership that would see them through many dangers. The weight of the curse pressed down on Kelemvor more heavily with each passing year. He was not yet 30 years old, but he felt ancient, worn down by the constant need to suppress his better instincts. Every merchant who handed over payment for his services, every negotiation over how much his sword was worth, every moment when he wanted to help freely, but could not. All of it fed into the exhausting cycle. Some members of his family had simply given up, had accepted the beast, and lived in the wilderness where the transformation did not matter. But Kelemvor was stubborn. It was perhaps his defining trait, more fundamental even than his skill with a blade. He refused to surrender to what his bloodline said he must become. He kept fighting, kept trying to find the balance, kept hoping that somehow he could break free from the pattern that had destroyed every Lyonsbane before him. This stubbornness would serve him well in the trials to come, though he could not know it then. The four companions traveled together through the spring and summer of 1357 Dale reckoning. They faced bandits and monsters, navigated political intrigues in small towns, solved mysteries that others were too afraid to investigate. They were good at what they did, complementing each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. Cyric's moral flexibility balanced Adon's rigid devotion. Midnight's arcane knowledge combined with Kelemvor's tactical mind to solve problems that might have defeated either of them alone. But tensions simmered beneath the surface. Cyric grew jealous of Kelemvor's relationship with Midnight, though he hid it behind layers of charm and misdirection. Adon struggled with doubts about his goddess, wondering why beauty and love seemed so powerless against the darkness they encountered. Midnight pushed herself harder and harder in her magical studies, driven by a need to prove herself that she did not fully understand. And Kelemvor carried the curse like a stone around his neck, growing heavier with each transformation, each moment when the beast emerged and reminded him of what he truly was. None of them knew that the gods were watching. None of them realized that they had been marked by destiny for roles far greater and more terrible than anything they had imagined. The Lord Io, the overgod who stood above all other deities, had seen corruption and complacency among the divine powers of Faerun. He had watched as gods grew distant from their portfolios, as they played games of power while neglecting their responsibilities, and he had decided that change was necessary, even if that change came through chaos and suffering. The time of troubles was approaching, though Kelemvor and his companions did not yet know it. Soon the gods would walk among mortals, stripped of much of their power, forced to navigate the world they had long observed from distant plains. Soon Kelemvor would face choices that would test everything he believed about himself, about justice, about what it meant to be worthy. Soon death itself would need a new master, though the path to that transformation would be far more complex and painful than anyone could imagine. But in those final days before the world changed forever, Kelemvor was simply a man trying to survive his own nature. He loved Midnight with a desperation that frightened him. He tolerated Cyric's ambitions because they served mutual goals. He respected Adon's faith even as he envied the priest's certainty. And he fought the curse day after day, transformation after transformation, never giving up even when surrender seemed like the only rational choice. This was who Kelemvor Lyonsbane was when the Avatar crisis began. Not a hero, not a saint, not someone chosen for greatness. Just a warrior with a terrible curse, trying to find meaning in a life that seemed designed to deny him peace. Understanding this, understanding the mortal struggles that shaped him, is essential to understanding why death needed him. Why the cosmos itself would be better served by a god who remembered what it meant to bleed, to fear, to love, and to lose. Section 2. The Time of Troubles and the Death of Death. The year 1358 Dale reckoning began like any other. But within months, the entire structure of reality would fracture. You need to understand that gods had always existed at a remove from the mortal world. They granted spells to their faithful. They answered prayers when it suited their purposes. They intervened through avatars and celestial servants. But they themselves remained in their divine domains, looking down upon Faerun from planes of existence that mortal minds struggled to comprehend. This distance had bred arrogance, complacency, and in some cases outright negligence. Lord Io, the overgod who existed above and beyond all other deities, decided that this separation had gone on long enough. The gods had grown too comfortable in their power, too disconnected from the responsibilities they were meant to uphold. Some had begun to scheme for greater influence, plotting against each other while their followers suffered. Others had simply grown lazy, treating their divine portfolios as inherited privileges rather than sacred duties. Io's solution was radical and terrifying. He would cast the gods down from their homes, strip away much of their power, and force them to walk Faerun as mortals did, vulnerable and desperate. The tablets of fate were the key to this cosmic restructuring. These artifacts defined the responsibilities and authorities of each deity, the boundaries of their power and influence. When Io discovered that two gods, Bane the Black Lord and Myrkul, the Lord of Bones, had conspired to steal these tablets for their own purposes, he had the justification he needed for divine punishment on an unprecedented scale. Every god was cast down from the outer planes, forced to inhabit mortal bodies, their divine essence compressed and constrained. Only by recovering the tablets of fate could balance be restored to the cosmos. Kelemvor and his companions found themselves caught in the middle of this cosmic catastrophe almost immediately. The signs came first in small ways. Priests across Faerun discovered that their prayers went unanswered unless they were within a mile of their deity's avatar form, their spells fading or failing at critical moments. Adon felt the disconnect from Sune like a physical wound, his connection to divine magic flickering and uncertain. Midnight noticed disturbances in the weave itself, the fabric of magic becoming unstable and unpredictable. Strange phenomena occurred with increasing frequency. The sky changed colors without warning. Gravity would shift in localized areas. Time itself seemed to stutter and jump. Then the gods themselves began to appear, not as the mighty beings of legend, but as avatars walking among mortals, desperate and dangerous. Some retained significant power even in their reduced state. Others were barely stronger than skilled mortals. All of them were searching for the tablets of fate, trying to navigate a world that suddenly felt alien and hostile. The Avatar crisis had begun in earnest, and Faerun would never be the same. Midnight became central to the unfolding crisis, though she did not seek that role. Mystra, goddess of magic and the weave, had been one of the deities cast down from the heavens. In her avatar form, weakened but still potent, she sought out talented magic users who might aid her in restoring order to the chaos. She found Midnight and recognized something extraordinary in this mortal woman. Midnight had an intuitive understanding of magic that went beyond mere study or practice. She grasped the fundamental nature of the weave in ways that even some divine beings did not. What happened next was both tragic and transformative. During a confrontation with the corrupted god Helm, who was guarding the gates to the divine realms on Io's orders, Mystra was destroyed. Her avatar form was obliterated, her divine essence scattered. But in the moments before her death, she transferred much of her power into Midnight, flooding the mortal woman with knowledge and abilities that no human was meant to contain. Midnight became something between mortal and divine, carrying the weight of a goddess's portfolio while still trapped in flesh and bone. Kelemvor watched the woman he loved change as Mystra's essence merged with her own. Midnight's power grew exponentially, but so did the pressure upon her. She was no longer simply a talented wizard traveling with friends. She was becoming the vessel for magic itself, the potential heir to one of the most important divine portfolios in existence. The transformation frightened Kelemvor even as he tried to support her. How could his cursed, mortal existence possibly be enough for someone who was being prepared to become a goddess? The group's travels took on desperate urgency. They were no longer simply mercenaries taking contracts. They were caught up in the search for the tablets of fate, pursued by fallen gods who saw them as obstacles or tools. Bane hunted them, the god of tyranny still formidable even in avatar form. Myrkul, the Lord of Bones who had helped steal the tablets in the first place, moved through the chaos, seeking to claim ultimate power for himself. Cyric revealed his true nature during these trials. The charming thief had always been self-serving, but the chaos of the Avatar crisis brought out something far darker. He saw opportunity where others saw catastrophe. If gods could die, if divine power could be claimed, then perhaps a mortal with sufficient ambition and ruthlessness could seize a place among the immortals. He began to scheme in ways that even Kelemvor, who had never fully trusted him, did not anticipate. Cyric acquired the sword Godsbane, though he did not know the weapon was actually the god mask in disguise, hiding in plain sight while pursuing his own mysterious agenda. Adon's faith shattered completely during these trials. The priest of Siun had built his entire identity around his goddess and her ideals of beauty and love. When she was cast down, when he saw her avatar struggling and desperate like any mortal, something broke inside him. His face was scarred during a battle, a jagged mark that ran from temple to jaw. In his despair, Adon interpreted this as a sign that Siun had abandoned him, that beauty had been stripped away as punishment for some failure he could not name. He fell into darkness, questioning everything he had believed, unable to find meaning in a world where gods could be reduced to vulnerable flesh. Through all of this, Kelemvor's curse continued to torment him. The constant danger meant he was always negotiating payment for protection, always walking the line between survival and the selfless heroism that would trigger his transformation. The beast emerged repeatedly, sometimes at critical moments when Kelemvor wanted desperately to protect Midnight without thought of reward. His love for her fought against the curse's demands, creating an internal war that exhausted him even as external threats mounted. The confrontation with Myrkul came in Waterdeep, the great city along the Sword Coast. The Lord of Bones rose from the pool of loss beneath the yawning portal inn, bringing with him a host of undead and fiends. He had grown powerful by consuming the essences of other fallen gods, adding their strength to his domain of death and decay. Myrkul was one of the greatest threats remaining in the Avatar crisis, a deity who had helped cause the entire catastrophe and now sought to use it for his own elevation to supreme power. Midnight confronted him atop Blackstaff Tower, the seat of magical power in Waterdeep. She wielded the abilities Mystra had granted her, channeling magic on a scale that should have been impossible for any mortal. Kelemvor fought beside her, along with the wizard Elminster, and others who recognized that Myrkul could not be allowed to succeed. The battle raged across the tower and into the skies above the city, death magic clashing with arcane power in displays that terrified the citizens watching from below. Myrkul seized one of the tablets of fate and attempted to ascend the celestial stairway, trying to force his way back to the divine realms and claim ultimate authority. But Midnight pursued him, empowered by Mystra's essence and driven by the knowledge that if Myrkul succeeded, death itself would be controlled by a being of pure malevolence. In the skies above Waterdeep, she cast a spell of disintegration, channeling power that no mere mortal should have been able to wield. The Lord of Bones was destroyed, his avatar form obliterated, his divine essence scattered. Death itself was left without a master. The aftermath of Myrkul's destruction was catastrophic. His death released plagues across the coast, and the dust that spread caused the dead to rise in what would become known as the Mere of Dead Men. But more importantly, his portfolio was left vacant, waiting for someone to claim the domain of death and the judgment of souls. This would not be Kelemvor's moment. That transformation would come later, through paths far more painful and complex than anyone could anticipate. Cyric's ambitions reached their terrible culmination in the weeks that followed. The thief who had traveled with Kelemvor and Midnight as a companion revealed himself to be something far more dangerous, using the sword Godsbane, which he still did not realize was the god mask in disguise. Cyric murdered Baal, the god of murder. This act, combined with his role in recovering one of the tablets of fate, marked him for divine ascension. When the Avatar crisis finally ended, when Io restored the gods to their proper places, Cyric was elevated to godhood. He claimed not just one portfolio, but multiple domains, taking death from the fallen Myrkul, murder from the destroyed Baal, and strife and tyranny from Bane, who had also perished during the crisis. But before his ascension, Cyric committed an act of betrayal that would echo through the ages. Atop Blackstaff Tower, in the same place where Myrkul had fallen, Cyric turned on Kelemvor. Perhaps it was jealousy over Midnight. Perhaps it was the knowledge that Kelemvor would never support his dark ambitions. Perhaps it was simply the cruelty that had always lurked beneath the thief's charming exterior. Using Godsbane, Cyric struck down his former companion, killing the cursed mercenary who had fought beside him through countless dangers. Kelemvor died on that tower. His curse finally ended not through breaking, but through murder. He should have gone to whatever afterlife awaited him, should have faced judgment like any mortal soul. But the sword Godsbane was not simply a weapon. It was the god mask in disguise, and Mask had his own plans. At the moment of Kelemvor's death, Mask stole his soul, hiding it within the blade itself. Cyric ascended to godhood carrying the weapon that contained his murdered friend's essence, completely unaware of what he held. Midnight also ascended when the Avatar crisis ended. She had proven herself worthy, had defeated Myrkul, and recovered the tablets of fate. Io recognized her as the rightful heir to Mystra's portfolio, and she became the new goddess of magic, taking the name and responsibilities of the deity whose power she carried. The woman Kelemvor had loved was gone, transformed into something divine and eternal, facing responsibilities that would consume her attention for ages to come. Cyric took control of the Bone Castle, Myrkul's former realm where souls were judged. He inherited the Wall of the Faithless and all the systems of death that had been maintained for millennia, but becoming the god of death, murder, strife, and tyranny, all at once began to corrupt him almost immediately. The portfolios were not meant to be held by a single deity, their competing demands creating conflicts that even divine power struggled to resolve. Cyric started his reign, already sliding toward the madness that would define his tenure. And he could not find Kelemvor's soul. Despite controlling death itself, despite having authority over every soul that passed from life, Cyric could not locate his murdered companion in the Fugue Plain or the Bone Castle or any realm of the dead. This drove him to paranoia. How could someone be dead, but not among the dead? Was Kelemvor somehow not truly destroyed? Had he escaped judgment through some trick or miracle? The god of death and lies began to see conspiracies everywhere, trusting no one, suspecting even his own servants of hiding Kelemvor's essence. The sword Godsbane sat in Cyric's possession for years, the god mask patiently waiting within while Kelemvor's soul remained trapped and hidden. Mask had his own reasons for this deception, his own plans that would unfold in their proper time. But for Kelemvor, those years were an existence beyond any nightmare his mortal curse had inflicted. He was aware, but powerless, trapped in darkness, unable to move or speak or affect the world in any way. Death should have been a release from the curse, but instead, it became a new form of imprisonment. Cyric's rule over death was everything that the domain should not be. He was cruel and capricious, judging souls based on whether they amused or annoyed him, rather than any consistent standard of justice. He expanded the wall of the faithless, pressing more souls into dissolution. He encouraged undeath, seeing it as an expression of his power over the boundary between life and death. He terrorized the inhabitants of his own realm, using fear to maintain control, even as his grip on sanity weakened. The souls in the Bone Castle and the City of Judgment suffered under this regime. They had no advocate, no one who cared whether their judgment was fair or their afterlives appropriate to their lives. Death had become a tyranny, and there was no one powerful enough to challenge a god who held so many portfolios simultaneously. The cosmos itself seemed to groan under the weight of such concentrated dark power in the hands of someone sliding toward complete madness. This could not continue forever. Even gods are subject to certain laws, certain balances that must eventually assert themselves. The sword Godsbane would be discovered for what it truly was. Mask's deception would be revealed, and Kelemvor's soul would be released from its prison. What followed would be a revolt, unlike any the City of Judgment had ever seen. A transformation of death itself, driven by souls who had suffered too long under cruel and unjust rule. But all of that lay in the future. For now, in the immediate aftermath of the Avatar crisis, Kelemvor was dead and trapped. Midnight was divine and distant. Cyric was mad and powerful, and death itself had fallen into the hands of the worst possible master. Section 3. Learning to Judge the Dead. For 10 years, Kelemvor's soul existed in a prison beyond imagining. Trapped within the sword Godsbane, which was in truth the god mask wearing the guise of a weapon, he remained aware but powerless. He could sense the passage of time, but could not move or speak or act. He knew that Cyric wielded the very blade that contained his essence, that his murderer had ascended to godhood and claimed the portfolio of death itself. The irony was bitter beyond words. Kelemvor had spent his mortal life fighting a curse that transformed him into a beast. And now in death, he was imprisoned within a weapon, conscious but completely powerless. Mask had his own reasons for concealing Kelemvor's soul. The god of thieves and shadows had long sought to expand his influence, and he recognized an opportunity in the chaos surrounding Cyric's ascension. A deity who held death, murder, strife, and lies simultaneously was an abomination waiting to collapse under its own weight. Cyric was already sliding toward madness, his paranoia growing with each passing year. Mask planned to use Kelemvor's hidden soul as a weapon against Cyric when the time was right, leveraging it to bring about the mad god's downfall and claim some of his power in the process. The city of Judgment, which had been reorganized into the Bone Castle under Cyric's rule, became a place of terror for the souls who passed through it. Where Myrkul had been cold and exploitative, Cyric was actively cruel. He judged souls based on whim and mood rather than any consistent standard. Those who amused him might receive pleasant afterlives regardless of their deeds in life. Those who annoyed him, even through no fault of their own, could be consigned to torment or pressed into the wall of the faithless. His priests in the mortal world were similarly erratic, preaching contradictory doctrines and executing heretics for crimes that changed definition from day to day. The souls in the fugue plane suffered tremendously under this regime. They had no advocate, no one who cared whether their judgment was fair. Many waited for months or years, while Cyric ignored his responsibilities to pursue other interests or paranoid schemes. The wall of the faithless grew larger than it had ever been under Myrkul, swollen with souls who either genuinely lacked faith or simply had the misfortune to die when Cyric was in a particularly foul mood. The entire system of death, which was meant to provide order and transition for every mortal who ever lived, had become a tyranny ruled by a mad god who could not handle the weight of his own power. Cyric's inability to find Kelemvor's soul drove him to increasing paranoia. He searched constantly, using divinations and interrogations, torturing his own servants who might have knowledge of where his former companion had gone. The fact that Kelemvor seemed to have simply vanished, neither appearing in the fugue plane nor claiming any afterlife, suggested to Cyric's fractured mind that a conspiracy was underway. Perhaps Kelemvor had somehow survived. Perhaps he was plotting revenge. The sword Godsbane sat in Cyric's possession all the while, the god Mask patiently waiting as the mad deity spiraled further into instability. Other gods watched Cyric's deterioration with growing concern. Mystra, who had been Midnight, and who remembered both Kelemvor and Cyric from mortal days, recognized that something had to be done. A god of death who could not perform his duties properly threatened the entire cosmic order. Souls were being misjudged or left in limbo. Undeath was spreading As Cyric encouraged necromancers rather than opposing them, the wall of the faithless had become so massive that it threatened to destabilize the fugue plane itself. She began to quietly coordinate with other deities, including Torm, god of duty, and Ogma, god of knowledge, to find a way to challenge Cyric's authority without triggering divine war. The conspiracy extended even into Cyric's own church. Saul Kembril, who had been a high priest of Bane before that god's destruction during the Avatar crisis, outwardly served Cyric, but secretly worked to undermine him. Saul's loyalty had always been to Bane, and he saw Cyric as a usurper who had claimed portfolios he could not properly manage. When Mystra approached him through intermediaries, suggesting that chaos in Cyric's bases of power might create opportunities for change, Saul was receptive. He began to sow discord in Gentle Keep, one of Cyric's most important centers of worship, creating situations that demanded the mad god's attention and further strained his already fractured focus. The revolt in the City of Judgment itself began among the souls who had suffered longest under Cyric's rule. These spirits, some of whom had waited decades for proper judgment, began to organize. They whispered among themselves about the injustices they had witnessed, about how death had been better even under Myrkul's cold exploitation than under Cyric's mad tyranny. They remembered stories some of them had heard before dying. Tales of Kelemvor Lyonsbane, who had fought alongside the woman who became Mystra, who had been known for his sense of justice despite his curse. Some wondered if his soul might still exist somewhere, if he might be convinced to challenge Cyric, if he could be found and freed. Mask saw his moment approaching. The sword Godsbane had been designed to eventually reveal itself, to turn on Cyric when the god was most vulnerable. As the chaos in Gentle Keep and the City of Judgment intensified, as Cyric's paranoia reached new heights and his grip on sanity weakened further, Mask prepared to spring his trap. He had kept Kelemvor's soul hidden for 10 years, nurturing it, preparing it for what would come next. The god of thieves and shadows had his own agenda, his own plans for claiming power from Cyric's fall, but he needed a weapon, and Kelemvor's righteous anger at his imprisonment and murder would serve perfectly. The moment came when Cyric finally discovered what Godsbane truly was. The sword revealed itself as Mask, and in Cyric's rage and fear at being deceived for so long, at having carried his enemy so close without knowing it, he destroyed the blade. It was exactly what Mask had calculated would happen. In shattering the sword, Cyric released Kelemvor's soul, freeing it into the City of Judgment itself. The mad god's worst nightmare came true in an instant. His murdered companion, the one soul he had searched for desperately for a decade, suddenly stood before him, reborn in divine form. The confrontation between them was not simply physical. It was a battle of wills, of righteous fury against mad fear. Kelemvor, empowered by Mask's preparations, and fueled by 10 years of impotent rage at his imprisonment, faced the god who had murdered him. Cyric should have won easily. He was a greater power, holding multiple portfolios, wielding divine authority that Kelemvor, as a newly freed soul, should not have been able to challenge. But Cyric's fear and madness became his defeat. He hesitated, second-guessed himself, saw threats and conspiracies in every shadow. His power, spread across too many competing domains, could not focus properly when he needed it most. The souls in the city of judgment rose up during this confrontation. They had waited for exactly this moment, for someone who might challenge the tyrant who had tormented them, led by those who had suffered longest under Cyric's cruelty. They attacked the mad god's servants, seized control of key positions in the city, and created enough chaos to prevent Cyric from calling for divine reinforcements. It was a revolt unlike any the realms of the dead had ever seen. Souls themselves fighting for their right to fair judgment and proper rest. Kelemvor defeated Cyric not through superior power, but through the clarity of purpose that his former companion lacked. Where Cyric saw enemies everywhere and could not trust his own strength, Kelemvor fought with the focus of someone who had spent 10 years unable to act and would not waste this opportunity. When it became clear that Cyric could not hold the city of judgment against the combined assault, the mad god fled back to his remaining strongholds, abandoning the domain of death to save what he could of his other portfolios. The souls of the city of judgment acclaimed Kelemvor as their new judge. They called upon him to take up the mantle of death, to become their lord and protector. This was not how gods were typically made. Ascension usually came through the will of the overgod Io, through heroic deeds rewarded with divine spark, through claiming power from fallen deities. But Kelemvor's situation was unique. He had already died and been imprisoned for a decade. His soul had been prepared by a god, had proven itself in combat against another deity. And most importantly, the realm of death itself was calling for him. The accumulated will of countless souls demanding someone better than what they had endured. Lord Io recognized what was happening and chose not to intervene. The overgod had been displeased with Cyric's handling of death almost from the beginning. The mad god's inability to properly manage one of the most important cosmic responsibilities had created imbalances and suffering that threatened the stability of the entire system. If the dead themselves were choosing a new judge, if Kelemvor had proven himself worthy through his victory and his long suffering, then perhaps this was exactly the change that death required. Io allowed the ascension to proceed, stripping the portfolio of death from Cyric and granting it to Kelemvor. In the year 1368 Dale Reckoning, 10 years after his murder atop Blackstaff Tower, Kelemvor Lyonsbane became a god. Not through seeking power or divine ambition, but through being chosen by the very souls he would judge. His first act was to transform the bone castle into the crystal spire, purging the corruption and darkness that Myrkul and Cyric had built into the structure. Where once there had been instruments of torture and chambers of exploitation, he created halls of quiet dignity where souls could wait for judgment in peace. His second act was to address the wall of the faithless. Kelemvor looked at this massive structure, swollen beyond recognition by Cyric's cruelty, and felt revulsion at what death had become. The souls pressed into the wall included not just those who had genuinely rejected the gods, but countless others who had been condemned through Cyric's whim or poor timing. He could not simply destroy the wall. This became clear immediately. The structure served a purpose in the cosmic order, maintaining the covenant between gods and mortals that made divine power possible. But he could reform how souls were judged, how the wall was used, who deserved to be placed there. Kelemvor began to implement a new system almost immediately. He would judge souls based primarily on their deeds and the lives they had lived, with faith as an important but not sole consideration. Someone who had lived virtuously, who had been kind and just, and had worked to make the world better, might deserve a good afterlife, even if their worship had been inconsistent or absent. Conversely, evil deeds would be punished appropriately regardless of how fervently someone had prayed. The wall would be reserved for those who had actively and deliberately rejected the entire divine order, not simply for anyone who had died without perfect faith. This represented a radical departure from how death had been administered for millennia. Under Jurgil, judgment had been bureaucratic and mechanical. Under Myrkul, it had been exploitative. Under Cyric, it had been mad and cruel. Now Kelemvor proposed something different. Judgment based on actual justice, on evaluating the full context of mortal lives, rather than reducing everything to simple categories of faithful and faithless. The proposal was idealistic, perhaps naively so. Kelemvor was still very recently mortal, still carrying the sensibilities and moral framework he had developed while cursed and desperate. He did not yet fully understand the political realities of divine power or the practical challenges of judging millions of souls. The other gods reacted with alarm when they understood what Kelemvor intended. If mortals could achieve good afterlives through deeds alone, why would they bother with worship and devotion? The entire structure of divine power rested on mortal belief and prayer. Gods needed that faith to maintain their strength and authority. Kelemvor's reforms threatened to starve them of worship, to convince mortals that they could simply live good lives and ignore the temples entirely. A coalition of deities approached him, expressing concerns that ranged from reasonable to self-serving. Some genuinely worried about cosmic stability. Others simply feared losing followers to a god who seemed to offer salvation without the inconvenience of devotion. Tyr stood with Kelemvor from the beginning. The god of justice recognized a kindred spirit in this new lord of the dead, someone who genuinely cared about fairness, even when it was costly or difficult. If souls were to be judged, Tyr argued, they should be judged on the full truth of their lives. Faith mattered, certainly, but it could not be a shield against evil deeds or a replacement for genuine virtue. The two gods formed an alliance that would prove crucial in the conflicts to come, providing Kelemvor with at least one powerful supporter among the established pantheon. But even with Tyr's support, Kelemvor faced enormous pressure to moderate his reforms or abandon them entirely. The souls continued to arrive at the fugue plane by the thousands every day, each one requiring judgment, each one presenting the same impossible questions about how to balance mercy and necessity, faith and deeds, individual circumstances, and universal principles. Kelemvor threw himself into the work with the same stubbornness that had kept him fighting his curse for decades. He would not surrender to what tradition demanded simply because it was easier. He would create a just system of death or exhaust himself trying. He also faced the challenge of establishing his church in the mortal world. Cyric still maintained followers despite losing the death portfolio, and many of them opposed Kelemvor simply because he had overthrown their god. Myrkul's old cultists, those who had gone into hiding after the time of troubles, saw Kelemvor as weak and naive, a god who did not understand that death should be feared and exploited rather than treated as a natural transition. Some even worked to undermine his authority, spreading rumors that he was too compassionate to properly judge the wicked, or that his mortal origins made him unfit for divine responsibility. Kelemvor needed priests who understood his vision, who could communicate his teachings to mortals in ways that offered comfort rather than terror. He found them among former soldiers who had seen too much death in war, among healers who had watched patients die despite their best efforts, among gravekeepers and morticians who had spent years tending to the deceased. These became his doom guide, a priesthood dedicated to the principle that death was a natural transition to be faced with dignity, rather than an ending to be feared or exploited. The doom guide began to spread across Faerun, establishing temples and shrines, teaching Kelemvor's doctrine that death was part of life rather than its opposite. They hunted undead with particular fervor, seeing the animation of corpses as a violation of everything their god represented. They offered comfort to the dying and the grieving, explaining that a fair judge waited on the other side, someone who would evaluate lives with compassion and justice. Slowly, gradually, Kelemvor's influence grew as mortals began to understand that death itself had changed, that the terrifying tyranny of Myrkul and Cyric had been replaced with something genuinely better. But Kelemvor was learning painful lessons about the gap between ideals and reality. His initial judgments took too long because he insisted on examining every detail of every life. The fugue plane became crowded with waiting souls, some of whom grew confused or unstable from lingering too long in the gray limbo. He had to develop standards and categories, ways to judge more efficiently, even though it meant sacrificing some of the individual attention he believed every soul deserved. The work of being a god of death was revealing itself to be far more complex and demanding than anything he had imagined. And always, the wall of the faithless stood before him, a constant reminder of the compromise between what justice demanded and what cosmic necessity required. He had reduced the number of souls sent there, had created exceptions and special considerations, but he could not abolish it entirely without triggering conflicts with other gods that might destabilize the entire pantheon. So the wall remained, slightly smaller than under Cyric, but still massive, still terrible, still filled with souls experiencing slow dissolution. Kelemvor looked at it and saw both the limits of his power and the reason he had to keep fighting to expand those limits. This was who Kelemvor was in his early years as a god. Idealistic and determined, stubborn and compassionate, powerful yet constrained, fighting to create justice in a system that had never prioritized it before. He had been a cursed mercenary, had been murdered by a friend, had been imprisoned for a decade, and had become a god through the will of the dead themselves. Every aspect of that journey informed how he approached his divine responsibilities, creating a god of death, unlike any who had come before. Section 4. The Wall of the Faithless and Moral Choices. The wall of the faithless haunted Kelemvor's thoughts in ways that no other aspect of his divine portfolio could match. You must understand that this was not simply a barrier or punishment. It was a living structure composed of the souls themselves. Countless spirits pressed together into a massive edifice that stretched across the fugue plane like a scar across reality. The souls within it experienced a slow dissolution, their essence gradually consumed by the plane itself over the course of centuries. It was not quick death, not merciful annihilation, but a prolonged fading that allowed full consciousness of what was happening. When Kelemvor looked at the wall, he saw faces. Thousands upon thousands of them, expressions frozen in various states of despair, resignation, confusion, or anger under Cyric's mad rule. The wall had grown to include not just those who genuinely lacked faith, but anyone who happened to die when the god of death was in a particularly cruel mood. Kelemvor had already removed many of these souls, extracting them from the wall and sending them to afterlives more appropriate to their lives. But even reduced, the structure remained massive, filled with spirits whose only crime had been to live without devotion to any deity. The theological justification for the wall was straightforward enough, at least on the surface. The gods sustained reality through their divine power, and that power came from mortal worship and belief. Those who chose to live without faith were choosing to exist outside the covenant between mortals and deities. They benefited from divine maintenance of cosmic order, while refusing to contribute to that order through devotion. The wall was the consequence of this choice, the price of rejecting the system that made mortal life possible. This logic had satisfied Jurgel's bureaucratic mind and had served Myrkul's exploitative purposes. Cyric had simply used the wall as another tool of terror. But Kelemvor could not accept this reasoning without question. He had been mortal too recently, remembered too clearly what it felt like to struggle with forces beyond his control. His own curse had been divine punishment for an ancestor's greed, imposed with no consideration for the innocent descendants who would suffer for generations. How could he not sympathize with mortals who looked at divine authority and decided it did not deserve worship? How could he condemn to the wall those who had simply made different choices about where to place their faith and devotion? He began to carefully examine the nature of faithlessness itself, trying to understand the nuances that previous death gods had ignored. Some souls in the wall had been active atheists, people who denied the existence of gods despite overwhelming evidence, and worked to turn others away from worship. These individuals had made a deliberate choice to reject the divine order, fully understanding the consequences. Based on what Kelemvor could observe, their placement in the wall seemed defensible, if harsh. They had chosen to exist outside the system and were experiencing the result of that choice. But others were different. Some had been merchants too busy with trade and family to develop genuine devotion, who prayed occasionally out of cultural habit, but never truly believed. Some had been scholars who questioned divine authority on philosophical grounds, seeking truth through reason rather than faith. Still, others had simply been born in places where God seemed distant and uncaring, where prayers went unanswered so consistently that belief withered like crops in drought. These souls had not actively rejected the gods so much as failed to embrace them, and the distinction seemed important, even if the traditional system treated both cases identically. Kelemvor started to make exceptions based on these distinctions. If someone had lived a particularly virtuous life, if they had been kind and just, and had worked to make the world better despite lacking faith, he would sometimes spare them from the wall. He would assign them to neutral planes where they could exist in peace, not serving any god, but also not suffering dissolution. These were small acts of mercy, individual judgments that bent the rules without breaking them entirely. This could imply that Kelemvor believed virtue itself had value independent of faith, a radical notion in a cosmos where divine worship had always been treated as the highest moral good. The other gods noticed immediately. They came to him individually and in groups, expressing concern that quickly escalated to anger. What was he doing? The wall served a crucial purpose in maintaining the divine order. If mortals learned that they could achieve decent afterlives without faith, worship would decline across Faerun. Gods would weaken as their follower base eroded. the entire structure of cosmic power would destabilize. Some deities made these arguments with genuine concern for cosmic stability. Others were more transparent in their self-interest, openly worried about losing followers and the power that came with them. Helm, god of vigilance and protection, was particularly vocal in his opposition. He argued that rules existed for good reason, that breaking them, even for compassionate purposes, created dangerous precedents. If Kelemvor could spare faithless souls based on personal judgment of their virtue, then other gods might claim the right to similar exceptions. Soon, every deity would be bending rules to favor their preferred outcomes, and the entire system of cosmic law would collapse into chaos. Order, Helm insisted, required consistency. The wall might be harsh, but its very harshness provided clarity. Mortals knew the consequences of faithlessness and could choose accordingly. Kelemvor countered that laws, which produced unjust outcomes, needed to be changed, not blindly enforced. He pointed to specific souls he had spared from the wall, asking the assembled deities whether these individuals truly deserved their fate. A mother who had died protecting her children from bandits, but who had never worshipped because she had been too exhausted by farm work and childcare. A healer who had spent his life treating the sick without payment, driven by compassion rather than religious conviction. A scholar who had dedicated herself to expanding mortal knowledge, believing that understanding the natural world was valuable in itself, even if not directed at any specific deity. Did these souls deserve the wall? Did their lack of formal faith outweigh the good they had done? Kelemvor insisted that any just system of divine law had to account for such cases, had to recognize that morality extended beyond simple worship and devotion. The debates raged through divine councils and formal gatherings, with gods taking various positions based on their own portfolios and philosophies. Ilmater, god of suffering and endurance, sided with Kelemvor. He argued that the wall inflicted suffering without purpose of redemption or growth. Suffering that taught nothing and led nowhere violated the principles he embodied. If the faithless were to be punished, it should at least offer some path toward understanding or transformation, not simple dissolution stretched across centuries. His support provided Kelemvor with a valuable ally, though Ilmater's influence among the pantheon was limited by the very nature of his portfolio. Gods of power and strength often dismissed the god of suffering as too focused on weakness and victimhood. Tyr continued to stand with Kelemvor, arguing that justice demanded souls be judged on their actions and the full context of their lives. Faith was important, certainly, but it could not be a shield against evil deeds or a replacement for genuine goodness. If Kelemvor wanted to create a more just system for the dead, Tyr would support him. The god of justice had his own political weight, his own followers and allies, and his backing meant Kelemvor was not completely isolated in his reforms. But other gods opposed the changes with intensity that sometimes approached hostility. Shar, goddess of darkness and loss, predictably argued against any reduction in the wall's power. She fed on despair and dissolution, drew strength from the fading of souls. The wall was a perfect expression of her portfolio, a place where hope died slowly and inevitably. She insisted that Kelemvor's compassion was weakness, that death should be harsh and final, that souls who rejected the gods should face consequences that made clear the cost of that rejection. The theological debates spread beyond the divine realms into mortal society. Priests across Faerun began to argue about the nature of faith and the requirements for a good afterlife. Some insisted that faith was paramount, that without devotion to a deity, there could be no salvation from the wall. Others suggested that good deeds might earn divine favor, even in the absence of formal worship. Still, others questioned whether gods had the right to demand worship as a condition for avoiding eternal suffering. A radical position that got more than one philosopher executed for heresy in particularly conservative regions. These debates sometimes turned violent. In Waterdeep, followers of different faiths clashed in the streets over whether the wall was just. In Kelemvor, temples became centers of political struggle as various factions argued about the relationship between faith and morality. In the Dalelands, some communities split along theological lines, with families divided over whether Kelemvor's reforms represented divine mercy or dangerous innovation. The certainty that had once characterized religious belief was giving way to doubt and argument, and not all mortals handled such uncertainty well. Kelemvor watched these conflicts with growing concern and what might have been regret. He had wanted to bring more justice to death, but his attempts at reform were causing suffering among the living. Mortals were fighting over theological positions that he himself was still trying to understand. The certainty that had once characterized religious belief was eroding, replaced by questions and debates that had no clear answers. Was this better than the old system? Was theological struggle preferable to blind acceptance of harsh rules? He genuinely did not know. He began to reconsider his approach, though not his fundamental principles. Perhaps Jurgel and Helm had been partially right when they warned that trying to perfect the system of judgment would create more problems than it solved. Perhaps there was wisdom in establishing clear rules and applying them consistently, even if those rules sometimes produced outcomes that troubled his mortal conscience. Clear standards, at least, gave mortals something to understand and plan for. They could choose whether to worship, knowing the consequences of that choice. Was that not a form of fairness in itself? But every time Kelemvor considered returning to stricter enforcement of the wall, he would encounter another soul that made him hesitate. A young woman who had lost faith after watching her family die in a plague, despite her fervent prayers to every god she knew. Could he send her to the wall for losing belief in a moment of profound grief? A soldier who had fought honorably for years to protect innocent people, never worshiping because he believed that actions mattered more than prayers. Did that soldier deserve dissolution simply for holding a different philosophy about how to live a good life? Kelemvor began to develop a more nuanced position, one that tried to balance his reformist impulses with the practical realities of divine responsibility. The wall would remain as a consequence for those who deliberately rejected the divine order, who lived in active opposition to the gods and their authority. But those who simply lacked faith through circumstance, confusion, or honest philosophical disagreement might be spared if they had otherwise lived virtuous lives. It was a compromise that satisfied neither the reformers who wanted the wall abolished, nor the traditionalists who insisted on strict enforcement. The Doom Guide, Kelemvor's mortal priesthood, struggled to communicate this nuanced position to common believers. How were mortals supposed to understand the difference between acceptable and unacceptable faithlessness? What constituted virtuous living in the absence of religious devotion? The priests tried to develop guidelines and teaching parables, attempting to explain that the key was intent and effort rather than perfect theological understanding. Someone who genuinely tried to live well, who treated others with kindness and worked toward justice, would likely be judged favorably, even if their worship was inconsistent. Someone who actively rejected the gods while committing evil acts could expect the wall. But the essential ambiguity remained, and that ambiguity was itself a source of anxiety for many mortals. Under previous death gods, the rules had been clear, even if harsh. Now Kelemvor's judgment would be based on factors that mortals could not fully predict or control. Some found this liberating, permission to focus on living well rather than performing religious obligations. Others found it terrifying, the loss of clear guidelines about how to secure a good afterlife. The Doom Guide did their best to provide reassurance, but they could not eliminate the uncertainty that came with a God who judged based on nuance and context rather than simple categories. Kelemvor also had to confront the practical reality that his reforms were affecting divine power dynamics in ways he had not fully anticipated. Gods whose appeal had primarily been based on offering good afterlives through faith alone found themselves losing followers. Why worship Lathander for renewal or Sune for beauty when you might achieve a decent afterlife simply by being a good person? The deities whose portfolios aligned with mortal desires rather than moral principles were especially vulnerable to this erosion of their follower base. Conversely, gods whose teachings emphasized virtue and good behavior saw their influence grow. Tiers following expanded as people understood that justice in life might lead to justice in death. Ilmater attracted new devotees who appreciated that their suffering might be considered worthy even without perfect faith. Kelemvor himself gained worshippers, people who saw death as something that could be faced with hope rather than fear. Knowing that a fair judge waited on the other side, who remembered what it meant to struggle and suffer as a mortal. The shifting power dynamics created new political pressures that Kelemvor had to navigate carefully. Some gods suggested that he should formalize his exceptions to the wall, creating a clear category of virtuous faithless who would receive decent afterlives. This would stabilize the situation, giving mortals clear expectations while allowing his reforms to continue. But other gods opposed this vehemently, arguing that any formal recognition of virtue without faith would fundamentally undermine the divine covenant that sustained their power. Kelemvor found himself in a position he had never imagined as a mortal. He was not simply judging individual souls. He was shaping the entire relationship between gods and mortals, determining what faith meant and what consequences would follow from its presence or absence. This was power on a cosmic scale, the ability to define fundamental aspects of religious reality. It terrified him even as he tried to use it wisely, even as he struggled to balance his mortal sense of justice against the practical requirements of divine responsibility. The weight of these decisions pressed down on him with increasing intensity. Every choice about the wall affected millions of souls, both those waiting in the fugue plane and those still living who would someday face judgment. Every theological position he took rippled through mortal society, changing how people understood their relationship with the divine. He could not simply do what felt right in the moment. He had to consider long-term consequences, unintended effects, the ways that even well-meaning reforms could create new forms of suffering. Kelemvor began to understand why previous death gods had maintained stricter, harsher systems. Not necessarily because they were cruel or indifferent, though Myrkul certainly had been, and Cyric was simply mad, but because complexity created its own problems. When judgment was simple and rules were clear, at least mortals knew where they stood. They could make informed choices about worship and faith. But when judgment depended on nuanced evaluation of moral worth, when exceptions multiplied until they threatened to become the rule, mortals faced uncertainty that was itself a form of suffering. Yet he could not bring himself to simply abandon his reforms and return to the old ways. That would mean accepting that the souls he had spared from the wall deserved dissolution after all. It would mean admitting that justice was impossible, that the best you could do was maintain clear rules, even when those rules produced terrible outcomes. His mortal conscience, still alive beneath his divine essence, rebelled against such resignation. He had not fought his curse for decades, had not endured murder and imprisonment and ascension, just to become another cold administrator of death. So Kelemvor continued to walk the narrow path between reform and tradition, between mercy and necessity. He judged souls as fairly as he could, sparing those whose lack of faith seemed truly innocent, while maintaining the wall for those who had actively rejected the divine order. He listened to the debates among mortals and gods, adjusting his approach when new arguments revealed flaws in his thinking. And he carried the weight of knowing that whatever he decided, souls would suffer, that perfect justice remained forever beyond his reach, even with divine power at his command. The wall of the faithless stood on the fugue plain, smaller than it had been under Cyric, but still massive, still terrible, still filled with souls experiencing slow dissolution. Kelemvor looked at it and saw both the failure of his reforms to completely eliminate injustice and the reason those reforms remained necessary. As long as the wall existed, he would struggle with its purpose and its cruelty, and as long as he struggled, as long as he questioned and doubted and tried to find better ways, death would have a judge who remembered what it meant to be mortal, to face impossible choices, to live with consequences you never chose. Section 5. Why death needed a fair judge. To understand why Kelemvor represents such a profound shift in the nature of death itself, you need to see him against the backdrop of those who held this portfolio before him. The history of death gods in Faerun is long and often dark, a chronicle of beings who viewed mortality as something to exploit, control, or simply process with cold efficiency. Each brought their own philosophy to the role, and each left their mark on how souls understood their ultimate fate. Myrkul was the first, the ancient deity who once controlled death, strife, and tyranny as a unified portfolio. He was order incarnate, a being who saw existence as something to be catalogued and managed with perfect precision. Under Myrkul's stewardship, death was bureaucratic. Souls were sorted into categories with mechanical efficiency. There was no cruelty in his judgment because there was no emotion at all. He simply recorded what each soul had been, where they belonged, and sent them there without hesitation or second thought. In many ways, Myrkul's approach was fair in its absolute consistency, but it was also devoid of the compassion that mortal existence sometimes required. Eventually, Myrkul grew weary of his responsibilities. The ancient god simply tired of the endless work, the constant flow of souls, the weight of managing forces as fundamental as death and conflict. Three ambitious mortals, Bane, Baal, and Myrkul, sought to claim his power. They stormed his realm and confronted him at his throne, prepared for a battle that would shake the cosmos. But Myrkul surprised them by willingly offering to divide his portfolio among them. He challenged them to a game of chance and skill to determine who would receive which domains. Bane won the game and chose tyranny, strife, and hatred. Myrkul came in second place and selected dominion over the dead. Baal came in last, so murder and violent death were given to him. Together, they became known as the Dead Three, gods who had claimed divinity through ambition and Myrkul's inexplicable willingness to step aside. Jurgil himself retained some divinity and agreed to serve as seneschal, managing the administrative details of death, while the new god held ultimate authority. Myrkul, the Lord of Bones, shaped death in his own image for over 1,000 years. He was undead himself, having achieved lichdom before his ascension, a being who had already conquered his own mortality through necromantic transformation. Where Jurgil had been cold but neutral, Myrkul was actively malevolent in subtle ways. He did not simply judge souls, he exploited them. The realm of the dead under his rule became a place where souls could be bargained for, traded, manipulated for various purposes. He encouraged the creation of undead, seeing them as proof of death's power and dominion. He hoarded souls like a miser hoards gold, treating the essence of mortal existence as currency in divine politics. The wall of the faithless grew massive under Myrkul's stewardship. He had no sympathy for those who rejected the gods, because he himself embodied divine authority taken through force and cunning. Any challenge to that authority, even passive rejection through faithlessness, deserved the harshest punishment. The wall served both as consequence and warning, a visible reminder to all souls of what happened when you lived outside the divine covenant. Myrkul added to it constantly, pressing souls into its structure with mechanical regularity. Cyric's brief tenure as god of death represented perhaps the worst possible stewardship of the portfolio. The mad god held death, murder, strife, and lies simultaneously, portfolios that were never meant to be combined in a single deity. The competing demands of these domains, combined with his own paranoia and instability, created a regime of terror in the city of judgment. Souls were judged based on whim and mood rather than any consistent standard. The wall of the faithless swelled beyond anything Myrkul had maintained. Undeath proliferated as Cyric encouraged necromancers to demonstrate the weakness of natural death. For 10 years, the dead suffered under a god who could barely manage his own sanity, let alone the fundamental cosmic responsibility of judging every soul that passed from life. When Kelemvor replaced Cyric, the contrast could not have been more stark. Here was a god who had been mortal within living memory, who remembered the fear of death and the desperation of trying to survive in a world that seemed designed to crush the weak. Where Myrkul had hoarded souls, Kelemvor wanted to free them to their proper afterlives as quickly as fair judgment allowed. Where Cyric had been mad and cruel, Kelemvor struggled to be just even when justice was difficult or costly. Where both previous gods had encouraged or tolerated undeath, Kelemvor opposed it fundamentally as a perversion of the natural order. The Doom Guide, Kelemvor's priesthood, reflected this transformed understanding of death in every aspect of their ministry. Under Myrkul, priests of death had been necromancers and death cultists, beings who embraced decay and saw in mortality only an ending to be exploited. They raised undead, conducted dark rituals, and generally spread fear of death wherever they went. Common people learned to dread the approach of death priests, knowing they brought with them the cold embrace of the grave, and possibly worse. Kelemvor's doom guide were different in fundamental ways. They wore silver and gray rather than black and bone, colors that suggested dignity and peace rather than decay and terror. They spoke of death as a natural transition rather than a terrible ending. They taught that every person would face a fair judge who remembered what it meant to be mortal, who would consider the full context of their lives rather than reducing everything to simple categories of faithful and faithless. The Doom Guide conducted 2 daily ceremonies that shaped how communities understood death and remembrance. The remembrance occurred each morning over graves, a dignified rite of songs and prayer, usually attended by relatives of the dead. This ceremony honored those who had passed while providing comfort to the living, reminding them that their loved ones now rested in peace under Kelemvor's fair judgment. The diem, or thanks to the guide, began after nightfall and was attended only by faithful followers. This celebration affirmed the strength and purpose of Kelemvor and his church, reinforcing among believers that death was not to be feared when a just God held dominion over it. The battle against undeath became one of Kelemvor's defining crusades. He saw in the undead a fundamental violation of the natural cycle, an attempt to escape the judgment that every soul was meant to face. Liches who preserved their consciousness in phylacteries, vampires who sustained themselves on the life force of others, zombies and skeletons raised to serve necromantic masters. All of them represented a rejection of death's authority and the order he was meant to maintain. Every time a soul was pulled back from death, trapped in undeath, or bound to prevent its natural transition, Kelemvor felt the transgression ripple through his divine awareness. He empowered his priests with abilities specifically designed to combat undeath. Doom guides could turn undead with holy power, forcing them to flee or destroying them outright if the creatures were weak enough. They could sense the presence of undead, detecting their corruption against the natural order even when hidden or disguised. They could bless weapons and armor to be more effective against such creatures, and in the most extreme cases, high-ranking Doom Guide could call upon Kelemvor's direct intervention, channeling his divine power to obliterate undead that threatened to overwhelm the living. This crusade put Kelemvor into direct and bitter conflict with Velsharoon, the god of necromancy and liches. Velsharoon had been granted Cyric's portfolio over necromancy when the mad god was stripped of some of his power. This suggests that other deities recognized the need for someone to oversee necromantic magic, even if it was distasteful. But Velsharoon embraced undeath as a form of transcendence, teaching his followers that transformation into lich or vampire was superior to any afterlife the other gods might offer. Kelemvor saw this as heresy of the highest order, a fundamental rejection of death's authority and the natural cycle that sustained all existence. The two gods clashed repeatedly through their servants and followers. Doomguide hunted Velsharoon's necromancer priests, destroying their undead creations and disrupting their dark rituals. Velsharoon's followers in turn sought to undermine Kelemvor's authority by demonstrating that death could be overcome through magic, that mortal existence could be extended indefinitely for those with sufficient knowledge and will. The conflict was theological as much as physical, a battle over whether death represented a transition to be accepted or an enemy to be defeated through arcane power. Kelemvor also opposed Talona, goddess of disease and poison, though their conflict was less direct than his war with Velsharoon. Talona brought death through suffering and decay, through plagues that ravaged communities and poisons that killed slowly and painfully, while Kelemvor accepted that death came in many forms, some more pleasant than others. He saw in Talona's methods a cruelty that served no purpose beyond causing pain. His priests often found themselves working to cure diseases or counteract poisons, not to prevent death entirely, but to ensure it came with dignity rather than prolonged agony. The relationships Kelemvor developed with other gods evolved significantly from his early days of divine existence. Initially, many deities had been skeptical of this former mortal thrust into such an important role. They questioned whether he had the wisdom or temperament to manage death properly. Some actively worked against him, trying to undermine his authority or manipulate him into decisions that would benefit their own portfolios. But as years turned into decades, as Kelemvor demonstrated both his commitment to justice and his willingness to learn from mistakes, attitudes began to shift. Tyr remained his closest divine ally throughout these challenges. The god of justice recognized in Kelemvor a kindred spirit, someone who genuinely cared about fair treatment, even when fairness was difficult or costly. The two gods coordinated frequently on matters involving the judgment of souls who had committed crimes or fought for justice in life. Tyr's faithful often found favorable judgment in death, not because of divine favoritism, but because those who devoted themselves to justice tended to live in ways that earned good afterlives under Kelemvor's more deed-focused approach. Ilmater, god of suffering and endurance, also became an important ally. He understood better than most what Kelemvor was attempting, the struggle to bring compassion to a role that had traditionally been administered with cold efficiency or active cruelty. Ilmater's own portfolio focused on acknowledging and easing suffering, teaching that pain could have meaning, and that endurance in the face of hardship was itself a form of virtue. He supported Kelemvor's reforms to the wall of the faithless, arguing that eternal suffering without purpose of growth or redemption violated the principles that made suffering meaningful. The relationship with Mystra remained complicated by their shared mortal past. She had been Midnight, the woman Kelemvor loved, before ascending to godhood herself. They had shared experiences that no other gods could fully understand, had faced the Avatar crisis together, had known each other in ways that transcended divine politics, but their responsibilities pulled them in different directions. Mystra had to maintain the weave and manage all arcane magic across Faerun, a task that consumed her attention and left little room for personal connections, even with other deities. Kelemvor had to judge souls and maintain the boundaries between life and death. They were allies in the sense that both wanted cosmic order and stability, but the easy companionship of their mortal days was gone, replaced by the formal interactions of divine peers, working toward compatible but separate goals. Myrkul continued to serve as seneschal in Kelemvor's realm, managing the administrative details of the Fugue Plain and the City of Judgment. Their working relationship was professional and efficient. Myrkul provided institutional knowledge and practical experience that Kelemvor desperately needed, explaining how systems had functioned for millennia and warning about the unintended consequences of reforms. In return, Kelemvor gave Myrkul a role to play without the crushing weight of ultimate responsibility. The ancient god seemed content with this arrangement, having long ago decided that he preferred to serve rather than rule. Cyric remained Kelemvor's most bitter enemy. The mad god had never forgiven the overthrow that cost him the death portfolio, never accepted that his murdered companion had returned to claim authority that Cyric believed was rightfully his. The two gods fought through proxies and servants, their ancient companionship twisted into divine rivalry that would likely last for eons. Cyric promoted chaos and deception wherever possible, trying to undermine Kelemvor's authority and prove that death should be feared rather than faced with hope. Kelemvor, in turn, worked to counteract Cyric's influence, protecting souls from the mad god's schemes and teaching mortals that lies and murder were perversions of how existence should function. The lasting impact of Kelemvor's mortal perspective on the nature of death itself cannot be overstated. He brought to the role something that no previous death god had possessed in the same way: recent, vivid memory of what it meant to be powerless in the face of cosmic forces. He remembered the fear of transformation under his family curse, the weight of impossible choices between survival and decency, the desperation of trying to find meaning in a life that seemed designed to deny him peace. This memory informed every judgment, every policy decision, every interaction with mortals who came to his realm. Mortals across Faerun began to see death differently under Kelemvor's stewardship. It was no longer simply an ending to be feared, a transition into unknown darkness, where cruel gods might judge you arbitrarily, or mad gods might torment you on whim. Death became something that could be faced with hope, knowing that a judge who understood mortal struggles would evaluate your life fairly. This shift in perception had profound effects on how people lived. Some became more devout, recognizing that faith still mattered in judgment, even if it was no longer the sole consideration. Others focused more on good deeds, believing that virtue might earn divine favor even without perfect piety. The philosophical debates that Kelemvor's reforms sparked continued long after the initial controversies died down. Theologians argued about the nature of justice, whether it should be based primarily on faith or deeds, or some complex combination of both. Ethicists questioned whether gods had the right to demand worship as a condition for avoiding suffering. Though these discussions were often conducted carefully to avoid charges of heresy, common people brought these matters into everyday conversation in ways that had rarely happened before. Discussing over meals and in taverns what it meant to live a good life and what awaited them when that life ended. Kelemvor himself continued to evolve in his understanding of what death required. He never became as cold as Jurgil or as cruel as Myrkul or as mad as Cyric. But he did develop a harder edge than he had possessed in his earliest days as a god. He learned that mercy without limits created its own problems, that justice sometimes demanded harshness, that maintaining cosmic order required difficult choices. The curse that had once tormented him had been broken by divine ascension. But in some ways, he had simply traded one impossible burden for another. Yet through all the struggles and compromises and painful lessons, Kelemvor maintained his core commitment to fairness. Every soul that came before him received genuine consideration. Every judgment took into account the circumstances of mortal life, the challenges faced, the choices available. He made mistakes, certainly, and he struggled with doubt and uncertainty, but he never stopped trying to create a system of death that served justice rather than simply maintaining divine authority or cosmic tradition. The crystal spire stands at the center of the fugue plain, transformed from the bone castle that Myrkul and Cyric maintained. Its architecture reflects Kelemvor's philosophy, dignified, orderly, but not cold or terrifying. Souls who arrive there find themselves in a place designed to offer peace while they await judgment, not fear or exploitation. The halls are quiet, but not oppressive. The servants who guide souls through the process are respectful rather than cruel or indifferent. It is, as much as such a place can be, a realm where death is administered with compassion as well as authority. This is why death needed Kelemvor. Not because he was perfect, not because he solved all the problems inherent in judging billions of souls, not because he eliminated suffering or made the afterlife a paradise for everyone regardless of how they lived. Death needed him because he brought to the role a perspective that previous gods had lacked or forgotten. He remembered what it meant to be mortal, to struggle, to face impossible situations where every choice seemed wrong, and he used that memory to judge with compassion as well as justice, to recognize that mortal existence was complicated and messy and often desperately unfair. When you die, when your time in this mortal world comes to its inevitable end, you will walk the gray expanse of the fugue plain. You will see the crystal spire rising in the distance. You will join the other souls waiting for judgment. And when your turn comes, you will stand before Kelemvor, Lord of the Dead, the fair judge, the god who was once a cursed mercenary trying desperately to survive in a cruel world. He will look at your life and see not just the facts of what you did, but the context of why you did it. He will consider your faith, but also your deeds, your intentions, the circumstances you faced. He will judge you as fairly as cosmic law and divine responsibility allow. And whether you earn a place in your God's realm, or the neutral planes, or even in the rarest and most deserved cases, the wall itself, you will know that your judgment came from someone who understands mortality, who remembers fear and hope and the struggle to be better than the world demanded. This is the legacy of Kelemvor Lyonsbane, the transformation he brought to death itself. Not perfection, but the honest attempt at justice. Not cold bureaucracy, but judgment tempered by memory of mortal experience. Not the end of suffering, but the recognition that suffering matters, that every life has value, that death itself can be administered with dignity and fairness by a God who never forgets what it cost to be alive. If you found this journey through the lore of Kelemvor fascinating, if you discovered something new about the fair judge, and why he replaced the evil death gods who came before, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on this video. Share your thoughts in the comments about whether you think Kelemvor's reforms to death were improvements, or if the old ways served better. And if there are other aspects of Dungeons and Dragons lore you would like explored in this depth, let me know. Until next time, may your own journey through life earn you fair judgment when your time comes to stand before the Lord of the Dead.